Well, welcome to Everyday Torah. I have got Heidi with us again, and Heidi will continue to be with us, and I'm real grateful for that. And if you haven't watched the first video I did with Heidi, or podcast, I certainly recommend watching that. It's a good introduction to Heidi, some of the things that are important to us. And one of the things that we got, hung up on last time, and it's an important topic for her, important topic for me, and that is how are men and women to interact, think about themselves in relation to Yahweh. And it's an important topic for me. I'm going to have Heidi share just a little bit because I have a question for you, Heidi. It has been a topic that we have, in our even in our informal conversation, it is a thing for us because we're working through it. And I think it might be good for people to hear from you. Why is a restorative man role, a woman role, how we understand and relate to each other important to you? There's some background stuff for you, and I might share a bit too. There's some background stuff for me that I kind of hold on to. But like you, what I want is rightness and goodness. But
okay, why don't you share what you're hanging on to? Because I haven't heard this part.
Oh, well, two things that I'm hanging on to. I think first of all, I come from a family of origin that's pretty healthy. Lots of love. I do feel secure. Those types of things, and I do come from a evangelical background that had the complementarian view. So, however you want to think through that, I do think in terms of equality, but I also think in terms of appropriate roles of maleness and femaleness. So I do think in those terms. I do have a desire to move to pre-fall, but at the same time, so here are the wounds. One was at Urbana. I went to Urbana, the missions conference in Urbana, Illinois, in 1993. And one of the breakout sessions that I went to, they interpreted the male-female as essentially obliterating those two entities. And so this lady was opening the door at that time for the gender issues. And so from that, I'm like, oh, this doesn't fit right with me. So there's that part of it. The other part of it is at the seminary where you and I work at, I actually did interview to work at Fuller a long, long time ago, before I even had my first job as a professor. And one of the reasons that I was denied by the local head person was that I did not have an egalitarian view, but a complementarian view. So because of that, I'm just like, I'm trying to be honest with my theology. And you know this about me. If anything, I actually want to exalt women. I see women as as really the pinnacle of the creation account. This is, and this is something I want to hold on to. It's very dear to me that I would be able to exalt Amy, my wife, that I would, and not like in a savior sense, but make her beautiful, lift her up. I'm to be a life source for her. And I was trying to communicate this at that interview, and I got shut down. And weirdly, I have now worked at that same institution through another route. The next time I was asked, but it probably 5 years went by. For me, I lost a lot of income and opportunity because of that issue. And goodness, I want things restored like anybody, and I want to do it rightly. So I have some, I guess, woundedness there, and that's probably the short part of my story.
Well, I'm sorry for what you experienced at Urbana, and everybody has some sort of story, and we are living in the midst of a big story.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that, but our stories as we move along the way bring opportunities for healing. We're always in a point of healing in our lives. we're never going to not be in points of healing of some way or another. So I would say that why I am interested in this restoration idea, I didn't perhaps come from the same type of home that you did. So as you would drive by our home, it looked typical in the neighborhood, but what was really going on in the interior of our lives, if you will, was a little bit different. So I would have not grown up with a secure attachment. And so I'm interested in the restoration of the male-female idea because I didn't have a strong sense of what that meant growing up. So, both of my parents have passed away, and I'm extraordinarily close to my father, but my father was a man that objectified women. And so I was raised with this idea that women were to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, and really their purpose in life was to please a man. And so then, I married into that same type of actually, a very toxic environment, and didn't have a good understanding of the male-female role, and then went to work in a church, also not in a biblically correct environment as far as the male and female roles. And so then as I came into my, young adult life and began to look at these for my own, there was a period of needing to rewire my brain. But things get set in motion and those triggers become, they take up neural occupancy. They take up real estate, right? And so we have to rewire how we're looking at that. And so I'm sensitive, especially because I'm a woman, I'm sensitive to the idea of being objectified. And so that is a really big point for me. Our female roles, our sexuality, the big picture of God's story, they're all interconnected, and sometimes they're quite messy. So, none of us have perfect parents. Even if you have a secure attachment, none of us have perfect parents because there are no perfect people, right?
Yeah.
The only perfect parent out there is God, and we are his children, and none of us are perfect. So we have to just face the fact that there are no perfect people and there's no perfect parent on earth. And so we're going to have some issues of some kind as we are maturing and going through the sanctification process. Because when we closed our last time together, we talked about how marriage was the practice for the great feast in Revelation. We are in the midst of a love story, and the bridegroom is going to return for his bride. So when we're talking about the law, think about what Romans 13:10 says. It says that love is the fulfillment of the law. So for husband and wife, what is that saying? It's saying that the law is to be the centerpiece because love is the fulfillment of the law. So the law is the centerpiece of the marriage, and sexuality expressed outside of the law, even in a marital encounter, that can be used for selfish motives outside that creative design and purpose, is illegitimate, like we talked about. I want to develop this idea, but not today because I have some other things I want to talk through.
Yeah.
But I want us to think about this. Sex is a form of holy fire. It is that way to achieve the one flesh that God is talking about in Genesis 2 and that Jesus is talking about. To accomplish that one flesh comes through that intimate act. And God does care about how we have sexuality because he cares about us. Our sexuality is intended to tell a story within the big S, the big story. And that's something that I want to develop another time, but I want us to be thinking about that right now because our experiences act as a lens through which our theology passes, right? The Apostle Paul, he clearly indicates an experiential dimension to his belief in God. And that transformative dimension includes the theological that's practical at its core, right? So when we're talking about the law and we're talking about the theology around that, a theology remote from everyday living, I think when you and Jacob were talking in a couple of podcasts ago, you mentioned James Dunn. James Dunn says that a theology remote from everyday living would not be a theology of Paul. that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so to just bring another layer to this, if you and I talked about internal working models, and for the viewer, our internal working model is just basically how our brains were wired from our initial childhood experiences growing up. And we can't separate our internal working model that was developed, so the schema that was developed in our childhood, we can't separate that from our spirituality. Because you can't separate your psychology from your spirituality. You can't bifurcate them.
Mm-hmm.
Yesterday, I took my granddaughters to see some horses, and there was a miniature horse there, and then there was a full-size horse, and she kept calling it a baby. She wasn't quite grasping the fact that it was bred that way to be miniature.
Yeah.
And when we separate our psychology from our spirituality, we are stunted, we are dwarfed, and we can't grow into the fullness of who we are supposed to be as believers. So Yahweh is showing us through Torah who to be more than what to do. I mean, I was thinking about this. I think of it like an algebraic expression. Okay, sometimes you're teaching math, Traver. Think of it as being over the doing equals the image of God. Or if you want to flip it around, the doing times in the image of God equals the being. But I really don't like that word doing, because we're supposed to be in a love relationship, right? We're supposed to be the bride of Christ. So I think we need to reframe how we're looking at this whole thing. And maybe I'm in the minority, but I don't think so. I think we need to reframe how we're looking at the male-female role and at that marriage role. Do you have anything you want to say before I just prattle on here?
No, I think you've brought us some interesting concepts for me, because it's an ongoing thing that, I read Leviticus 23 and I do the feast days. I seek to read the rest of the law, the instruction of God, and I seek to do it. But it doesn't adequately communicate what it is that I'm about or doing, because, I can read the clear instruction and do it, but connotatively, it doesn't get at it. What more gets at it is, I am a part of the bride of Messiah. In my heart, I can't.
Right.
It's like I'm going to do it. I'm going to do something anyway out of response to love. So I'm pressing into something, and what happens is the Torah, the instruction, gives me guidance on how to take this love energy that I have, put it somewhere, so that I can both worship the Lord the way the Lord wants to be worshiped, but also it ushers me into the identity that I long to be in. Yeah?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Do you know that the Latin root of the word sex is actually, I think it's sacard, I think is what it is, but it actually means to be broken. And so to be broken off from. And so when you look at the very beginning of our lives, before our sexual impulses come through puberty and all this kind of thing, there's this deep longing sense of being cut off, of not belonging. It's that need to be restored inside of us, to be the deep desire to be the reunion of Adam and Eve, so to speak, that is broken inside of us, off from God. So when, thinking about that bridegroom thing, just think about, your son got married a couple summers ago. Just think about if a bride comes to, the consummation bed, if you will, and she tolerates the culmination of the marriage act. What would that be? That would be like us doing Torah for the sake of doing Torah, rather than this beautiful offering of the best that she has to give, the most sacred act that she has to bring. This is a beautiful gift. And I think this is the heart and the spirit of how God wants for us to consider following Torah. You see that the male-female role, think about this. The nouns in Hebrew, the heaven is a male noun and earth is a female noun. We see right from the very first verse of Genesis, the preparation for male, female, right there. and that God will one day, that the heaven will be married to the earth, and Christ will return for his bride. And this is the heart and spirit for, I mean, it's just so intertwined. But in our culture, in our society, the way things have gone, sex has become such a polluted understanding of what it means. And so, you know, I don't know about the percentage of listeners of the show, but I represent that demographic, that didn't have this way of growing up. I didn't even understand discipleship from a traditional evangelical Christian perspective until I was in my early 30s. So as I was thinking about this, you know, my doctoral research, I did some initial studies to collect data on how people's attachment histories were impacting their relationship with Yahweh. So in other words, how distorted images of love, were embedded from early childhood internal working models that were getting projected onto God. Because studies show, and my research even shows, that it does. It gets whatever our childhood internal working model is, that is initially what gets projected onto Yahweh. And so until we each get to a place where we actually really know the heart and agape love of Yahweh, you know, we can't settle into that trusting, vulnerable, intimate place of relationship. And in that case, Torah would feel like an empty set of rules that we're trying to follow to grasp Yahweh. That those things could feel empty and distant and perfectionistic and hollow. And I know people that it does. And so trying to help them to pivot around and reframe it, it's not a simple thing. Yahweh wants for us to relate to him in a way like that marriage bed that's so intimate and so loving. And that's just the created order that we see. Can you only imagine the intimacy with Yahweh that we don't quite understand and can't grasp because we don't fully grasp him?
So are there general categories that people might fall into as they were reared by their parents that would create those mental models that they would then project onto Yahweh, their relationship with Yahweh, and how they would understand the Torah?
That's a really good question. And yes, and the first time that we talked, I briefly mentioned that there are, as far as clinical attachment styles, they break down into 4. So there's the secure attachment, which would mean that you have a consistent and satisfying relationship with the parent as far as the primary caregiver is consistently meeting the needs. Because remember, this is developed in an infant that can't talk, can't walk, can't feed itself. So it's about what the needs were that were being met. Were they consistent and were they satisfying the need?
Okay.
And then the next 3 would be insecure. And they're anxious. Anxious avoidant is one.
Okay.
And anxious preoccupied is the other. And then there's a 4th one, which is disorganized. So let's start with disorganized. Fewer people have a disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment would mean that my primary caregiver is the one that scares me half to death, but yet I need the caregiver. So, the person that's causing the greatest amount of fear, yet I'm coming toward that. And so those population of people would generally be schizophrenic. They would be sociopaths. They would develop into these.
Okay, so not
models.
all, just the extreme.
Most disorganized attachments are going to fall into that, but it's a smaller percentage of people.
Oh,
and then
gotcha.
The 2 insecure, and then the 2 insecure attachments that I mentioned, the anxious avoidant and anxious preoccupied. Anxious and avoidant is an infant learns that, I'm showing emotions, but I'm not, my caregiver is not understanding my emotional impulses, and it's not doing me any good to show these emotional impulses, whether I'm tired or hungry or a messy diaper, whatever it is. There's not mom is not attuned to that. And so infant learns to shut down those feelings because they're not doing anything for the infant. It's not a conscious decision. And then there's preoccupied, anxious preoccupied, where sometimes primary caregivers meeting the needs, but it's not consistent. And so baby grows up being anxious. I'm not sure if my needs are going to be met. Oh, here they are, but it's not consistent. So those are the styles of attachment, generally speaking. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So then we're going to approach God with whatever, because we're going to transfer from our primary caregiver onto God, hopefully at some point, this attachment style. And that's the experience that we're going to have. We're going to, like I grew up thinking that I had to do all these things to please God, and that I could really never do enough to please God. Can you hear my attachment style in there?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was a perfect candidate to follow Torah in that, oh, these are all the things that I do. But my theology surpassed those kinds of triggers. And so we have to look at Torah in tandem with our internal working model to distort distorted images of love that are associated with our childhood. Those are polluting our relationship with Yahweh, right? And then think about it. Romans 13:10 again. Love is the fulfillment of the law, right? So can you see how that would, if you have distorted images of love, and love is the fulfillment of the law, that seems contradictory. 1 John 4:16 says that God is love. But if the way you've experienced love as a young person, and I'm not talking about you, Traver, but what about me? I had an abusive household. My mom was extraordinarily abusive to all of us, and my dad was an alcoholic. Our image of love was very distorted. So there are people out there that probably have said, well, I had great parents. Well, I think I was a great parent, and I think I'm a great grandparent, but I know I am not a perfect one. I just know that I'm not. So I think it's helpful for us to consider how our internal working models from our childhood get in the way of us approaching Yahweh.
So I think myself and everyone listening would think, I think two things. Number one, hey, I want to get this fixed so that way I can appropriately relate to the Torah in a way that is connotatively aligned with rightness, goodness, wanting to respond to God's grace in a right and healthy, good way. And then we've got to pivot somehow because I want to understand male-female relationship properly, and how can we make that right? So what are your thoughts on making this right?
Okay, good question. Because, when you're on an airplane, what does the flight attendant say in the pre-boarding thing or pre-takeoff thing? She says, put your own oxygen mask on first before you put your neighbor's oxygen mask on. And so Paul, we know, is the first neuroscientist, the Apostle Paul, because we see him saying in Romans to not conform to the pattern of the world. Okay, your internal working model is part of that pattern of the world. Do not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And people don't remember this part, so that you can be free to know and do the will of God. The whole point of being transformed is to be free to know to do the will of God. And Traver, that my doctoral dissertation intersects Romans 12:1 and 2 with interpersonal neurobiology. And interpersonal neurobiology is the study of how our minds come into being through experiences in this world. So thinking about that, so that word transformed, I won't give you the Greek, but that just means change into another form. By the renewing of our mind, I will skip the Greek. That just means a complete change for the better. If you look at the definition, it's a complete change for the better of your mind. So those faculties of perceiving and understanding. So change into another form. This is what Paul is telling us we can do. And science is now backing it up. You can see it in fMRI imaging scans, that we can change into another form, a complete change for the better in the faculties of perceiving and understanding ourselves in the world. So I think you mentioned the word sanctification. As we submit and let go of the trappings and submit to Torah for our lives, God not only changes how we think and how we behave, but he actually changes the brain structures in our brains. Our bodies and brains embody our souls, right? And I loved the other day when you were talking, I think when you were in the Romans, and you talked about us being trichotomous. There are a lot of people, and at Fuller, that they're dichotomous. They don't believe that we have an indwelling of the Spirit. And I don't even know how people can be so divergent because it's not scriptural. But we have a free will. And by exercising that free will, we can actually change the wiring of our brain. Okay. And you know that process, it's called neuroplasticity. So as we're drawn deeper and deeper into that Romans 12, 1 and 2 process, we become the outflow of Christ-like character traits. Okay, and that is what becomes visible in relationships. So as we live out that biblical male and female role, that husband and wife role, those can't be separated from our psychology or our internal working models. So remember, now, the image of love, if it's distorted, that's what we're bringing to the relationship. And so we're bringing that not just to our marriage relationship and our relationship with others, but our relationship with Yahweh.
I need to process something here because it's because you've already referred to it. I am going through just a verse by verse thing through Romans. I just got done. I finished Romans 7 recently, mm-hmm. And what Paul does at the end of Romans 7 is he says, "Hey, I want my mind to be transformed." And we know where he's going because he's going to go You're leaping over to Romans 12 because Paul is amazingly repetitive because he realized that it takes a little while for people to get it. And I get this, and it is complicated. And the complicated part is that Paul, now that he is saved in Romans 7, he is no longer obligated to sin, to his flesh. He is now obligated by righteousness. But the way that Paul does it at the latter part of chapter 7 is he recognizes that he has the flesh, but he recognizes that in his flesh he can't go do Torah right. In a sense, what he has to do is his mind has to be transformed. It has to come under the control of the Spirit, but he's not super clear, but it seems that he says that, but we work in tandem, maybe the phrase work out your salvation, we work in tandem with the Spirit because the Spirit is writing the Torah on our hearts. It's just like this genuine love, this genuine desire to be conformed to the image of Messiah. But he recognizes too that he has to take every thought captive and to give the members of his body over to something. So there's this very external, like he's going to do the law because he recognizes that it is right and good. It's spiritual, but his flesh can't do it. So he's got to be transformed on the inside and tap into that and then still go do it.
Dunn says that in that context of that, what you're talking about right there, he says that you have to walk not in accordance with the Spirit, but be led by the Spirit. And so when he's talking to the Romans at this point, he's basically saying, look, you've been walking in accordance with the Spirit. You've been following Torah, but now this is a new era. This is a new time. What you've been waiting for, there's an eschatological implication of Jesus that is now ascended into heaven, and now we need to and can be led by the Spirit, which is, according to Don, is not simply walking in accordance with the Spirit, but being led by the Spirit.
Yeah, that's a good distinction because what Paul does in Romans 10 is he testifies that his Israelite brothers and sisters have much zeal for God, and they do that in observing the law. It's walking according to the law, but it isn't by being the led part isn't there. And you've got to have that salvific experience to be led. And he wants them to be saved.
Right. See, and this goes back again to love. If an accurate concept of love as God intended is distorted or missing, then relationships can't flourish the way we were created to exist. Theology, like Dunn said, creates the context for understanding our humanity as whole persons. But in order for theology to be effective, it's got to be viewed and practiced through a language of love as a compass that guides relationships, right? Because Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. What is the law? The instruction. What is God? First John 4 tells us God is love. But the language of love can take on different meanings from person to person. Like between you and I, we've had very different childhoods based on our childhood experiences with our primary attachment figures. That early imprint of love acts as a filter in how a person experiences, receives, extends love. It even influences how valuable or lovable a person perceives himself. I've never told you this, but I was hit by a car when I was 5, holding my mom's hand. I was up at Mount Wilson when I was 5 with my mom. And what kind of a child holding its mom's hand can get hit by a car? Do you know where the observatory is? That's where we were, at the observatory. And when I was 2, I overdosed on, she had these diet pills, and I can remember doing it. And, by the time anybody found me and got me to the ER, they said, why didn't you bring her sooner? She's going to die. There's nothing we can do. And they tried to bring my mom up on charges. So when we're talking about distorted images of love, and we're talking about that, those are the only experiences that I had of love. Do you see? So, and I'm more mainstream, actually. Maybe this is why I'm a counselor, right? But I'm more mainstream. There are more people who are struggling to understand that God is love. I went to church every Sunday, Traver. We sat down at the table and prayed before our meal. This is love. This is God's love. This is love in my home, right? The gift of love is from God, who's the source of self-giving love. But if our earthly mother and fathers do not reveal Jesus in the sense of a restorative love that makes life whole and relationships meaningful, right? Then we have this void that needs to be cleared up. And it takes time. If we're not like bananas, we don't just peel. We are like onions, and we come off a layer and layer at a time.
Yeah.
So these emotional wounds, and I know we have listeners that will have emotional wounds and acceptance issues, they actually become trust issues, right? Trust issues between man and trust issues between God. And they encourage this pseudo-self, right? The wearing of emotional masks that impede authentic relationships. I'm sure you can understand that. These distorted images prevent the ability to embrace one's full personhood. And I don't want this just to be a time of me just like purging here, but I grew up being very self-conscious, and you know my history. I grew up on television, and I came from a professional show business family, and I'm not just talking in my home, but also family members outside of my home. And I had a very distorted image of even myself, and for many, 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 many years. And, I never had an eating disorder or anything like that, but that's only by the grace of God. But I still, still today have a distorted image of how I appear, and this is probably not the place to unpack that. But
we're all family here.
From our childhood. Those things come from our childhood. And, so having 3 granddaughters is God's restorative love, because I can pour into my granddaughters that they are so beautiful because of who they are. And I can pour into my granddaughters that when you do those things, I see what a beautiful person you are when you're being kind to your sister, when you are being kind to me. And beauty doesn't have anything to do with an exterior that I could never measure up to in a show business world. Certainly you can understand that.
Yeah. Part of what you're reminding me of too is the importance of Yahweh wants us to honor our father and mother in the 10 Commandments. And I have alluded to, and I've never made this video, on why the honor your father and mother needs to be put into the vertical category, that moms and dads, when done rightly, should begin, are the formative, should be formative precursors in a sense of how children know the Lord. And when parents operate by walking in that Torah, by observing the feast days, by growing up their kids in that, by showing them what it means to live appropriately as husband and wife. This is so important. And so I think the part of the goal of honor your father and mother is that Yahweh intends that relationship be right in the first place as an appropriate way for a child to view what it means to have a relationship with God. Now,
yes.
Heidi, tell me, okay, so how does male-female fit into all this?
Well, I think that you just started to talk about the importance of how is a person going to know their role if their parents aren't demonstrating their role, right? And the next generation should be, and if I look back in my own family, it's true, should be better than the one that preceded them, right? And even a perfect example of it is yesterday I had my granddaughters at a store here, and when we got there was a sign that said, you have to have a mask. Well, we haven't had masks around here in a number of months now. Mm-hmm. And I looked at the guy because he was handing them out. And I looked at the guy and I said, mask? You've got to be kidding. Okay. My granddaughter said to me as we walked away, Oma, he's just doing his job. It's not his fault you have to wear a mask. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've just been convicted by this little girl who's not even 8. Yeah. So my son is training his daughter in a way that maybe I'm still growing in on my own, right? I wasn't even aware of the fact that so the male-female role is very important, because if we don't understand our place, how are we going to communicate it to anybody else? Think about what I said earlier about how heaven is a male noun and earth is a female noun. Mm-hmm. Right from the beginning, we see the importance of the male and female role. And then we see, Adam and Eve coming into that. And there's this wonderful book, and I actually have it here. It's called Why Does God Care Who I Sleep With? Can I read you a little paragraph out of this? Let me see if I can find what page it's on here. Because I think that he does such a good job of explaining this. Remember, I talked to you about sex, and the Latin root of that meant to be cut off. Long before we even come to self-consciousness, and long before we reach puberty, when our sexuality constellates so strongly around the desire for sex, we feel ourselves painfully sexed in every cell of our body, psyche, and soul. We wake up in the world, and in every cell of our being, we ache, consciously and unconsciously, sensing that we are incomplete, unwhole, lonely, cut off, that a little piece of something that was once part of a whole. And I think that the male and isn't that beautiful? And the male and female role help us to connect in a way that we feel the wholeness of Christ in a way that we don't feel it maybe in another setting of our life. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm processing what the full picture of that looks like. I mean, I have my own notions of it, but I think I want to hear more from you. And part of it is I want to go back to what was lost exactly in the Garden of Eden, and at some point, and this is where I lack. What I think that I am good at, in one sense, is, I have discovered what it really means to be a disciple of Yeshua. What does it mean? First of all, it means that we are transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. We're led by the Holy Spirit. But there's also these clear directives of God that as we press into those things, that shapes us over time. So it's a conduit, practices that God gives us, if you will, that contain a particular goal, a particular telos that exalts Jesus, that brings us into closer to conformity into the image of our Messiah. And those are things that I get to talk about. But I talk about it in general terms. And I am still learning the instruction of God, the Torah, if you will. And one of the places that I want to learn is, what does the Torah teach me about being a man, about being a husband that is right and good, that I am like Jesus for Amy, that I engage the sexual relationship properly. And the reason part of I say that is Amy and I have an innocent, good, healthy sexual relationship. But I have known, I've got people in my Christian life that they think that once you're married, anything goes in the bedroom. And I'm just
know what?
ooh,
that's horrible.
It's horrible.
There was a statistic that I read, and I've shared this with you, that Psychology Today is just a periodical that comes every month. And they did some research, and I think it was 73% of people polled, when I say polled, P-O, polled. Anyway, 73% of people that were polled said that they enjoyed and participated in a regular basis in rough sex defined as hair pulling, spanking, and choking.
Oh my gosh.
And so when you're talking about what is the whole point of the sexual relationship, and what is the whole point of being one flesh, I don't think it has anything to do with that. But can I just stop before we get to that point? Because you asked earlier, you talked about disciplines and spiritual disciplines and following Torah. And, I want to go back to the oxygen mask thing, where the flight attendant says, put your own mask on before you can help someone else. Because I want to bring in the neuroscience piece to that, because when I was doing my doctoral research, one of the things that I found, not just in my own data, but in the data of others that I was looking at, is that these spiritual disciplines that you're talking about from Torah practice can facilitate the very things that neuroscience and attachment research suggests as reflections of a healthy mental state, or shalom, we would see in the Bible.
Okay.
So when we are practicing, studies have been done. There's a fabulous book called The Fingerprints of God, and it's a collection of all of these research things, statistics, but there is a spiritual residue that is left behind neurologically in significant spiritual events, things that we participate in that create an actual stain, if you will, on the brain. And in just 12 minutes a day, over an 8-week period of time, they found that practicing prayer and meditation on God's word would actually thicken the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is about 1 or 2 pieces of paper thick. And they found that it was like 3 or 4 pages thick. Okay, cerebral cortex. Can you see my brain over there? It's kind of like just the top layer, or the hard crust over.
Yeah,
like
I've got several
Okay.
models of the brain around my house too.
Okay.
I don't.
So,
Who has that, Heidi?
Well, I do.
Yeah.
But the point is this, is when we practice, prayer, when we have this concentrated time of our lives being focused with Yahweh at the center and always being mindful of that, that actually strengthens the 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex is the front part of your brain, or the boss of your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And the 9 areas that I'm talking about, prayer, concentrated prayer, and reading God's word, it is said to strengthen the body regulation that we have. You understand body regulation, or attuned communication with other people. Mm-hmm. Our emotional balance. You've heard of emotional regulation. Response flexibility, not being reactive, being able to emotionally regulate and just, thoughtfully say what you need to say. Empathy, insight, fear modulation, being able to, be practical about fearful things, intuition, mortality. So those first 8, those are actually associated with a secure attachment.
Okay.
Okay. And so when these 9 domains of the prefrontal cortex are well integrated, okay, how do we integrate them? It neurologically leads to a state of shalom or well-being. Okay. So in the clinical world, they would say equanimity or eudaimonia, which means a place of mental calmness, mental wellness. You and I, in a spiritual sense, know that it's called shalom. So the brain is able to reorganize. It's able to remap itself into a place of shalom through prayer and meditation and a life focused with Yahweh at the center. So you might say, well, why should I care if my cerebral cortex is strengthened, if it's thickened? So that's our gray matter. It determines our intelligence, our personality, our motor function, our planning, our organizing, the sensation of touch. So there are lots of reasons that I say Paul is the first neuroscientist, because he's telling us how to experience shalom. We're hearing Torah, but what we're really experiencing is a restoration of who we were supposed to be mentally. Because remember, I had said that when Adam and Eve experienced that being cut off from the garden, what they really experienced was trauma. And when you and I are not in a state of shalom, and I'm speaking from a neuroscience perspective, we are actually creating trauma in our brain. And so Torah is like the prescription, if you will, to say, this is the way, walk in it. This is the way, walk in it.
So we're going to keep hammering on this male-female thing. We'll get there. But part of the reason that I was super excited, interested, here I am. I'm I'm going to be self-deprecating, but country bumpkin pastor guy, that my whole goal is I fell in love with my Messiah. I just want to make disciples. I want to teach people how to walk in the things of God, and I want to do it from, it's a spiritual thing. It's an intimacy, love, prayer thing. It's a genuine relationship with the Lord, but there's also this content, this, what do we do? And you come at it from a neurological perspective. I've come at it from, because I didn't know, right? I just when I went into the PhD program, I'm like, how am I going to really understand what discipleship is? And what happened to me was someone had already put a little bird in my ear. Hey, Torah is for the believer. And I remember sitting with this guy. His name was Scott. God bless him. And I just like, oh, you are a big kook. But every time that I meet with someone and they tell me something that I'm not comfortable with, I just say, okay, right. Well, I'll go explore this and see if there's any merit to it, because, all you're trying to do is Jewishify me, and this is not how I was raised. So anyway, I went to the drawing board and I thought through it, and over time I started to. Well, what happened, the end of the story, as everyone knows, is that I'm like, oh my gosh, this Torah is for believers. But the way that I got at it initially was first re-understanding the Apostle Paul, but secondly, it was not through neurological science, if I said that right, but it was through communication theory. And the communication theory part is just how do we actually hear things? How do we hear God properly? What actually happens? And what I've discovered, apart from the Bible, is that we hear things only amid our present environment, how we've been shaped as a person. In other words, our social context, our how we grew up, all that stuff is actually how we interpret the words of the Bible, how we read it, how we understand God. And so I figured out that, oh my gosh, what God did with the Israelites is he didn't give them a bunch of doctrine. He wanted a relationship with them and knew that he couldn't give them a bunch of right things. What he gave them was a bunch of things to walk in so that their environment itself would be shaped, that when God spoke to them, they would have a context by which to understand it. So I knew it from a communication point of view, and that kind of parlays into it educational point of view. And the education part is, how do we really learn? Well, we really learn by the environments that we set up. And in that, when you speak as a grandma, when you speak as a mother, it is heard in the context of the environment by what you set up for your girls, your grandchildren. So when you take them to see horses yesterday, when you say things, it will make sense, and they will process it amid that relationship. It's not just the thing that you did with the horses, it's the relationship that was developed by going and being with them in that way. You see what I'm saying, right?
I do. A person's religious story is a story of relationship. And I love that you talk about falling in love with Yeshua, because the process of religious conversion has been likened by scholars and religious writers to falling in love. And my grandchildren are falling in love with Yeshua through me. But let me tell you something, is that our experience, you talk about the learning, okay? So our learning is directed by our attention, and our learning, the nucleus accumbens, which is a place in the side of your head here. If I could get up and get my brain model and take it apart, I would show you. But that's where the reward and motivation center are together. That's where the dopamine mostly is transmitted through. So if the perceived reward isn't great enough, the motivation won't be there. So if understanding who Yeshua is, if that image of love is distorted, there's not a great enough motivation to seek him out. So we have to tear down that's why I wanted to talk about this today, because we have to tear down and deconstruct those old models of understanding what love is. Because God is love. That's what the Bible says. So if someone who's been emotionally wounded repeatedly reads God as love, they're going to say, I don't want any of that. We have to deconstruct those old models. We have to put our own oxygen mask on first. We have to deconstruct those broken models of what love is, those distorted images, so that we can get to a place where we can hear, not with our ears, but with our heart and with our mind. So the dopamine receptors flood so that we want to follow Oma into Torah.
Yeah. So my, I sort of lost my thought there, but
sorry,
that's okay.
Ultimately, does that make sense what I'm saying?
No, it does make sense. I just had, you had my little prefrontal cortex going crazy. So I had to, I can't stay on task quite as well as you, but here's what I'm going to, these are all necessary conversations as we not today, but we'll move into those male-female relationship things. But my guess is that in the same way that parents should set up a environment that creates healthy, good emotional, mental models for kids, there is a sense it's the same thing applies, that as man and woman relate properly to one another, that it is my charge from the Lord to create an environment for Amy that creates a safe, appropriate, wonderful environment, an emotional, mental model that can be created in that she might relate properly to Yahweh. And Amy does the same for me.
Right.
And I think at some point, I want to know.
It's like puzzle pieces that fit together.
Oh, sure. That's a great analogy. And I think that there's a responsibility of parents for their kids to set up proper environments. And it's something that's unique for parents to do with their children. And the same principle applies for married couples, is that there's a puzzle piece with parents and their kids, and there's also another puzzle piece that fits with husband and wife and husband. And we could probably ultimately parlay that out to the rest of the community, that we also relate to others in the context of the ecclesia in a right way, setting up good emotional environments. Am I on track with how you're thinking?
I think so. And, as you were talking, what came to mind for me is how if you look at how at the creation account, everything is cyclic. Everything is created in cycles.
Yeah.
There are cycles.
Yeah.
And we even see cycles in how we walk through life and die, and how we experience Torah, how we experience appointed time. And I think about how typically, traditionally, when a husband and wife come together at the end of the day, if that intimate act is going to occur, it's going to occur at the end of the day in bed before they go to sleep. Or
in Hebrew, at the beginning of the day.
Okay, well, that too. But the whole point is that both of them are good as far as I'm concerned. But in any case, I forgot my train of thought here. What was I even saying?
You did it to me. I've done it to you.
I know, but that was a good distraction. Okay, what was I going to say about that? Because that actually should, when we talk about Yahweh, and we talk about that puzzle piece of coming together as husband and wife in the image of God, coming together in the image of God, it's cyclic in that way. Is that that's the intended purpose of that, is to be a blessing to the other person, to experience bliss. Sometime I'll talk to you about the Bliss Neurotransmitter, and the person that found that was Candace Pert in the 70s. And she came to realize in the way that this neurotransmitter that of bliss, she came to the conclusion, there has to be a God. There's no other way. This has to be that there is God. Even Albert Einstein came to that kind of conclusion as well.
Yeah.
But all of that to say, our intimacy between husband and wife has, for many people and in this culture, been distorted. And so reestablishing what God intended for Adam and Eve before the fall is our goal. And Christ made that possible. And the Holy Spirit in us allows us now to walk toward, with the Spirit leading us, that restorative state. Certainly. In preparation for the marriage.
Well, I want to affirm the cycle part. If I remember, I sent you that video, I think it's by Frank Sinkins, and talking about Seekins, yeah, and the Hebrew day beginning at sundown, and one of the hypotheses is that that is the time where a man and a woman have finished their work, but the real work starts with the family. You face your family, you come home. And those that are workaholics often don't want to face their family. Right. But the family is all important. And so we come home, we start the day with our family. And it's not just about the family, but it's also as the sun has gone down and there is a potential intimacy. And this intimacy, whether it culminates in sexual activity, is irrelevant. It's how Amy and I treat each other together when we're holding hands and doing dishes and being together in our oneness is all important. So there's that aspect. And you might not know this, but even when David in Psalm 23 says, "You lead me in paths of righteousness," that Hebrew word is cycles. You lead me in cycles of righteousness. So it's the cycles of Sabbath, the cycle of the day, the cycle of those appointed times. These are all things that are geared to create environments that the net effect is discipleship, over and over and over, training us, creating an environment by which our little neuroprocessors can engage with our Father in heaven in a right and good way.
Researchers say that the only time a human being doesn't experience fear is in that climax of the sexual relationship with one another. That those are the only moments that we are ecstasis is the Greek word, right? Mm-hmm. That we are so outside of ourselves that we have no fear, and there's that bliss in there. And when we go and look at the Greek and like John experiencing ecstasis and these points of being so absorbed in who God is, it's the most beautiful place where we feel free from all of the trappings of this world that are so polluted, and can really come to this place of shalom and entering into the peace of what was taken from us at the fall. And when we experience that as a husband and wife in the way that I started talking about this earlier, not the 73% that are into the polling and all this kind of garbage. Oh my word. Traver, we have a lot to talk about.
We do. I just want people healthy. I want people to understand that when I talk about Torah, it isn't a bunch of rote laws. This is God's loving instruction for us. And if you practice it like the Pharisees and Sadducees did, if you practice it like people who are not walking in the Spirit, then, it's an exercise in religion. But when we let of the Spirit do it, and we're faithful to do it in that way, the goal here is shalom. Shalom in our marriages, shalom in our families, shalom in our ecclesial relationships, even in the workplace, that if we really want to be a light on a hill that people might see our Messiah, the witness isn't just a verbal assent to that Jesus is the Messiah. The witness is also our very lives, that we get to talk and share and model, and people can see, look at the shalom in this person's life.
Well, how about Galatians 5? We need to be evidence of the fruit of the Spirit, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And that is supposed to be the fruit of everything that we've just talked about.
It is. And we're going to keep talking about it. Well, Heidi, that's probably all the time we have for today. We'll just continue on the conversation. Thank you so much for being this kind of dialogue partner. Hey, the Bible is all important, and we need to continue to look at that, I would say verse by verse, because the author of the big conversation is the Scripture, and we'll do that. But it's good to have these types of conversations too, because it's important for us as believers to understand what it is. What is the goal of the Torah? Why is God giving us these particular instructions? Because I do think that the Torah exists there in the Garden of Eden. There's this fall, and very quickly, Yahweh pulls people out of Egypt, the Israelites, and he brings them back into a situation where they can, by the blood of a lamb, begin to walk in a right, good, healthy, starting restoration of the Garden of Eden all over again in that Torah. So it's a start, but then the Spirit comes with that new covenant, and it begins to equip us. And then, as we talked about in Romans 7 and on, the Apostle Paul continues to talk about how this is going to continue to restore as we move on to that culminating day where our bridegroom will come and get us again. So we'll pick up this conversation. In the meantime, just remember that your Messiah, Jesus, he didn't look very legalistic at all. And yet he walked in his Father's instruction every day. And that made him that sinless Lamb of God. And we want to be just like Jesus. We want to look like Jesus. And if we're going to do that, by the Spirit, led of the Spirit, we've got to give the members of our body over to God's perfect will, God's perfect instruction. And so we got to walk in that Torah every day. And that's why we call it Everyday Torah. Heidi and I will see you next time.